Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you ever stopped to think that in some places being poor means having to survive being forgotten? While some debate politics under full-blast air conditioning, others are literally melting in the streets. This story you're about to hear isn't about caped heroes or fancy speeches. It's about action, about an ordinary man, no ID badge, no media, no money, who chose to face 125 degrees, 52 degrees heat when everyone else was running from it. The craziest part? Everyone thought he went out to die, but he came back with 38 lives saved. And he didn't just save them with shade and water. He saved them with respect, improvisation, and courage. While the government disappeared, he showed up. While officials made promises, he made history, with his hands, with grit, and with dignity. And if you think this is just another nice narrative, get ready, because what happened there might just flip a switch in your own awareness. Now tell me, are you ready to see how a single decision can transform an entire community and expose a broken system? Then take a deep breath and come with me, because this story is going to ignite something inside you, in a way no outside heat ever could. The sun didn't just shine anymore, it crushed. And in that forgotten corner of the map, each ray felt like a sentence. Endure or give up. Elderly folks collapsed on curbs like dry leaves. Children searched for shade behind cracked walls, and no one showed up with a solution. No city vehicles, no health agents, just old promises evaporating in the scorching air. These stories, sadly, are common in places where abandonment is routine and power only arrives during election season. It felt like the outside world had forgotten lives existed there. An 82-year-old woman raising 3 grandchildren fainted near a closed bakery and lay there for hours. A boy named Ramon, 7 years old, cried because his grandmother said water was now only for drinking. No playing, no bathing, no cooling off, and when neighbors called emergency services, they heard the same dry reply. No estimated time for service in your region. But it's exactly there where the stories worth telling are born, because in desperation the brave rise. In the silence of neglect, someone always decides to make noise with action. While the city melted, a man rose. No badge, no camera, no promises. Just what he had, his body, his courage, and an idea. And maybe it's in those solitary decisions where the answer for what comes next lives. Eduardo wasn't known for speeches. He wasn't into meetings or protests. But he was the type to wake up early, even with no job to clock into. The neighborhood knew. If you needed a fence fixed or a makeshift roof, just knock on his door. So when he left that day, skin already red and a worn-out cap covering part of his face, many thought he was going to surrender to the heat, but he was actually going to face something even bigger, collective indifference. While others waited for a suited savior or a city truck, Eduardo turned the corner pulling an old cart with some buckets and scraps of tarp. He had no detailed plan, no funding, no authorization, but he had something rare, presence. And presence, when guided by compassion, moves more than public policy. He went house to house, calling those too weak to stand. While some mocked him, others just watched, because deep down, no one thought it would work. That's where many people are wrong. The best stories don't start big. They start with small acts done with truth. When Eduardo grabbed a leaky hose and tied it to a broomstick to make a makeshift sprayer, he didn't know he was starting something much bigger. An idea, when fed by courage, becomes a movement, and a movement done with soul spreads. But that only became clear when the first patch of shade appeared in the middle of the chaos. The first tarp was tied with clothesline wire. The structure, fragile, swayed in the hot wind, but it offered what no one else did, a breath of relief. Eduardo knew it wasn't ideal, but he also knew the ideal never shows up when you need it most. With scrap wood and frozen water bottles hung from the ceiling like humidifiers, he created the first shelter. And if you think that's not much, then you've never felt your body collapse in 125-degree heat. The strongest stories don't come from luxury, they come from necessity. Each day, Eduardo adapted something. Wet cloths in buckets became manual air conditioners, plastic chairs welcomed recovering elders, and even an old fan was donated by a neighbor who had lost his father to the heat the year before. On the wall, with a thick brush, he painted a simple phrase that became an anthem. It's not just shade that cools, it's respect. People stopped when they read it. And when they stopped, they reflected. And when dignity begins to be felt, even as a breeze, something shifts. The community started to join in. One lent a water jug, another brought extra tarp, a woman offered a bucket of ice she had saved for days. The shelter, born from a single act, was proving that collective action only needs a spark. And that spark they didn't know yet was about to go viral, and everything would change. It was just another scorching day when a journalism student passed through the community. He wasn't looking for headlines, just wanted to understand why no one was talking about this hellish heat. That's when he saw Eduardo, hunched over, fanning an elderly man with a piece of cardboard while children waited their turn to cool off under a wet cloth. The student took a discreet photo, no filter, no pose, and he posted it with a short, powerful caption. While everyone waited, he acted. And just like that, a new story reached the world. Within hours, the image spread across screens, neighborhoods, and borders. What was once seen as makeshift became a symbol of resistance. People started sharing with both outrage and hope. Folks asked how to help. Was there a fundraiser? A way to donate water? Tarp? Anything? That's how the kindness chain works. It starts with an emotional spark, but only becomes a flame when it finds empathy. And in that post, the world saw something in short supply: real humanity. The media showed up, influencers reposted, and even schools started discussing Eduardo's actions in class. But while the world watched in awe, he kept quietly fixing the tarp the wind had knocked down. Because the stories that really matter are the ones that continue after the likes disappear. But unlike other times, this movement didn't fade. It was just beginning. And the next day, the revolution got new arms. The day after the post, before the sun scorched the pavement, a doctor appeared with a first aid kit and a look that mixed concern with respect. She didn't come for an interview or to pose with a badge. She came because she saw the story and knew she couldn't wait anymore. She treated a dehydrated pregnant woman, cleaned the wounds of an elderly man with heat stroke, and taught basic care to the residents. And the most beautiful part? She stayed silent. No stage needed. After her, 2 engineers arrived with ideas in hand and tools on their backs. They analyzed the makeshift shelter and suggested ways to collect rainwater and improve air circulation using recycled materials. Young people from the community, once disinterested, now followed them like eager apprentices. That's when many realized, sometimes it's not technology that's missing, it's willpower. And when will spreads, it creates a domino effect. One helps, another learns, another teaches. And that's how stories become silent revolutions. In less than 48 hours, the shelter became a small hub of solidarity. Food started to arrive, fans were donated, and an architect offered to redesign the space. No one charged, no one commanded, everyone just contributed. And maybe that's the beauty so many forget. When the spotlight shifts, everyone becomes part of the solution. But the most impressive part was yet to come, and it had a number no one expected. In 1 week, what began with a single tarp became a lifeline for dozens of people. 38. That was the exact number. 38 human beings who, had nothing been done, might now be remembered as a footnote in some local newspaper. Children with cracked lips, elderly folks who had stopped asking for help, pregnant women who could barely breathe. All of them were sheltered, hydrated, protected, and most importantly, alive. No deaths were recorded in that area. None. And that didn't come from a decree or a social program or an official car with flashing lights. It came from action. A simple, quiet, courageous action. An action that became a story. Because what spread there wasn't just shade, it was humanity. On that patch of dry, scorching ground, Donna Irachema, 89 years old, found the strength to go on. On the first day, she could barely stand, her breathing broken by the suffocating heat. Today, sitting in the shade, she lovingly weaves damp cloths for the newcomers, as if each piece of fabric were an extension of her own hope. And then there was little Julia, just 5 years old, who smiled again after 3 days without playing. Her eyes lit up when she saw that someone cared, when she realized that there, she was seen. Every life rescued in that improvised tent got a second chance. And more than that, it gained dignity. Eduardo was never one to count numbers. But the neighbors did, and each new name protected was celebrated as a victory. They knew they weren't just fighting the heat. They were fighting neglect, omission, the silence of those who should have acted, and they were winning. There, on that forgotten street corner, one of the most powerful stories of resistance in recent times was born. A story with no cameras, no hashtags, no public funding, but with soul, with commitment, with presence. It's curious how the real stories of salvation don't always begin in hospitals, or big NGOs, or fancy speeches. Sometimes, they start beneath an old tarp, on a patch of unpaved land, with water shared in reused plastic cups, born of improvisation, but improvisation filled with intention. And it was there that the impossible was overcome, not with machines, but with calloused hands and attentive hearts. Because if there's one thing this story proved, it's that saving someone doesn't always require structure. Sometimes it just requires the courage to stay. As the shade grew and the number of rescued lives climbed across town, important people started to feel uncomfortable. Because when the people take matters into their own hands, the system trembles. The logic of control starts to shake. The offices, so used to deciding what deserves attention, were left speechless. Questions began to arise. Why had no one done anything before? Why did a retired construction worker have to assume the leadership the state abandoned? And why, despite all odds, was it actually working? Then they started showing up, first with suspicious glances, then with rehearsed smiles. They pretended to be surprised, took pictures, promised funding, put up signs with the names of programs no one had ever heard of. Some even dared to use Eduardo's image in institutional campaigns. But he, standing firm, refused. He simply said, "If you want to honor me, build more shade," and went back to arranging the plastic chairs. No vanity, no speeches, just action. As always, the most powerful stories don't ask for a stage, they ask for continuity. And that's what Eduardo understood from the beginning. So while the flashes came and went, Eduardo remained, cleaning, lifting, replenishing, helping whoever needed it. Because what mattered there wasn't recognition, it was results. It was looking into the eyes of someone desperate and being able to say, "There's a place for you here." And that sentence, spoken softly, had more strength than any decree. The community changed too. People who barely greeted each other were now working together. Young people who once called themselves useless began to care for the elderly. Children started helping set up the makeshift fans. It was there, in that humble shelter made of tarp and dignity, that a quiet revolution was born. A revolution that doesn't make magazine covers, but transforms the social fabric from the inside out. And those are the stories that truly last, because they're built on affection, truth, and purpose. Even local schools started using Eduardo's story in class. Teachers would say, "This is real leadership." And they were right, because leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who does the most with the least. It's about acting while others wait. It's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, even when everything tells you to protect yourself. And that kind of leadership, without a badge, changed the destiny of 38 people and inspired hundreds more. And then came the most symbolic moment of all. In the silence of the night, with no audience, no press, Eduardo picked up a thick brush, a can of white paint, and wrote on one of the shelter's walls, "It's not just shade that refreshes, it's respect." He didn't ask for help. He didn't make an announcement, he just did it, because he knew it was more than a phrase, and it was a reminder, a memorial, a tattoo on the wall that told anyone who cared to see, this is where a new awareness was born. And that phrase became a beacon. Visitors took photos beside it. Teachers brought entire classes to reflect on it. Influencers copied it in captions. But deep down, Eduardo stayed the same. Quiet, simple, observant. Because for him, no tribute mattered more than seeing someone sit in the shade, take a deep breath and say, "Here, I feel okay." That was the real medal, the true reward. The story he wanted to leave behind. And it stayed. It grew. It multiplied. Other communities started building their own shelters. The idea spread. The attitude became culture. And just like that, without trying to be a hero, Eduardo became a symbol of a time where compassion must move faster than politics, where improvisation, when done with love, is worth more than a perfect plan that never leaves the paper. In the end, when they asked him what he would have done differently, Eduardo thought for a moment and replied with the same calm as always, "Maybe I would have just started sooner." It was inevitable. When the story hit the news, the internet, WhatsApp groups, and influencer feeds, Eduardo quickly became a symbol. a symbol of resistance, of action, of dignity, and of course a symbol of something the public powers tried to ignore for as long as they could. But stories like this don't stay hidden for long. They carry their own force. They spread like fire on dry straw and burn through the structures that once looked down on those who did the real work. Then came the smiles. At first, timid, a little forced, trying to seem empathetic, then wider, accompanied by entourages, cameras, and microphones. "We came to help," they said. But no one there was fooled. They were late. They came because they saw the impact, because society noticed, because it hurt to see so much absence turned into initiative. Now they wanted to rewrite the narrative as if they had always been there, as if that story had been born inside some air-conditioned office, and not on the scorching pavement of a forgotten neighborhood. They brought plaques, inaugurations, budget promises, speeches filled with big words and rehearsed phrases. Some even took photos next to the wall where Eduardo, alone and in the middle of the night, wrote the phrase that became a symbol. "It's not just shade that refreshes, it's respect." Some posed as if they had painted every letter. Others made emotional videos with captions saying, "We're in this fight together." But those who were there from the beginning knew the truth. Were they really? Or did they only show up when the spotlight did? There, every resident could count the days they saw Eduardo rise before the sun, arrange the chairs, check the fans, fetch water, and comfort those who fainted. They could also count with precision how many cups of water the government sent in the early days. None. How many officials showed up when the children cried from the heat? 0. And now they wanted the spotlight? Not this time. Because some stories grow so much that not even the system can fully hijack them. The volunteers who had built that shelter with their own hands remained steadfast. They kept cleaning, caring, cooking. They did it without ID badges, without salaries, without posing. Ordinary people with rare courage. And paradoxically, that contrast made many uncomfortable. Seeing honesty being applauded, seeing improvisation outperform institutional planning, it was too much for some. Because these stories expose a painful truth. They lay bare the failure of indifference. There was a secretary wanting to hand over a trophy, a councilman offering the title of Urban Solidarity Ambassador. An aide even tried to convince Eduardo to run in the next election. "The people love you," they said. But Eduardo didn't want occasional affection. He didn't want a statue, a title, or the spotlight. He wanted shade. He wanted people to stop running with their grandmothers in their arms because the pavement had turned to fire. He wanted what they built there to multiply. And most of all, he wanted respect for those who had been invisible for too long. His refusal was simple: a polite smile, a firm handshake, and a phrase that silenced any insistence. "If you want to help me, build more shade." That was it. Then he turned and went back to work, picked up the broom, swept the shelter's entrance, greeted a group of teenagers arriving with more recycled fans. Nothing had changed in him, and maybe that's why everything changed around him. Because some stories teach more by example than any speech ever could. It was at that moment the community realized the power to transform doesn't live at the top, it lives next door. In Dona Jandira's home, who donated the first tarps. In Mr. Romulo's heart, who opened his gate to install another water point. In the strength of the youth who learned to build cooling systems with PET bottles. These stories don't need official stamps. They are already true because they were lived. But what truly marked that chapter wasn't the titles they tried to give Eduardo. It was the silent lesson he left with his actions. Because turning down positions is unusual, refusing honors is unexpected, and continuing to work even after fame is almost rebellious. He didn't want to become a character. He wanted to remain a bridge, and that made him more respected than any politician who set foot there, not because of a resume, but because of rare integrity. Days passed. The dust of fame settled. Journalists left. The emergency program signs began to fade, but the shelter remained. The shade kept growing. The children played again, and the elderly, once isolated, now had a safe place to rest. The community created a collective fund to maintain the space. And, interestingly, the absence of authorities stopped being missed, because this story had become self-sufficient. It was born from the ground. It grew with dignity, and it stood tall without needing a frame. Eduardo, meanwhile, stayed low-key. He walked through the shelter as if he were just another person, helped with repairs, organized shifts, sat in the shade with new arrivals, Some visitors didn't even know who he was. And he liked it that way. He preferred anonymity over stardom, because deep down he knew that true leaders don't need badges. They need presence, commitment, coherence, and he had all three. The tributes started pouring in, as if, suddenly, the entire country had awakened to what had happened. Invitations for interviews, award ceremonies, golden plaques with embossed letters, citizenship medals, honorary titles, community leader diplomas printed on fine paper. Journalists wanted his voice. Universities wanted his perspective. NGOs wanted his story as a symbol for transformation campaigns. Even TV networks mobilized, offering flights, dressing rooms, and microphones, also he could tell them what it's like to be an anonymous hero in Brazil. But Eduardo, as serene as the breeze he helped create amid chaos, declined every invitation with the same firm and disarming response. If you want to honor me, build more shade. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity, a rare kind of awareness that only blooms in those who have seen the absence of everything and still chose to care. Eduardo knew recognition is fleeting, but action is a seed, and a seed only matters if it grows. So, while headlines called him a symbol of climate resistance and columnists competed to interpret his gesture, he kept doing what he always did, pulling tarps with sunburned arms, arranging plastic chairs beside the same people who'd been there from day one, cleaning the improvised fans that helped the elderly breathe in peace. He used to say that heat teaches what books forget, that respect isn't decreed, it's built in the details. And for him, the greatest trophy was hearing a child say, "It's so cool here, huh?" Or seeing an elderly woman lying under the shade saying with relief, "Feels like even the sun respects this place." Because deep down, the story he wrote with his own hands wasn't about heroism, it was about humanity. And that's what hurt the most, knowing that something which should be the norm was being treated as the exception. As days passed, what began as a shelter became a school. Not a school with chalkboards and uniforms, but with examples. People who once didn't speak to each other now built together. Young folks who once felt useless were now called big brothers by the kids. Families that barely exchanged greetings now shared fruit, wet cloths, and words of care. And this movement didn't stay confined to one street. The story of the shelter echoed. In neighboring areas, similar structures began to appear. Donated tarps, shared water tanks, WhatsApp groups to organize care shifts. A humble neighborhood in the north became a model of community action in the country's south. A public school in the countryside used Eduardo's story to rethink how they taught citizenship. An architect created an urban shading project inspired by the shelter's improvised design. And so, silently and powerfully, that phrase, "build more shade," became the motto of something much greater. It's curious how the most transformative stories are born from the refusal of the spotlight. Eduardo understood with rare clarity that when you remove ego from the equation, change spreads faster. That's why he never accepted plaques with his name on them, nor tearful speeches placing him on a pedestal. He would say simply, "If it becomes too much of a tribute, it turns into a show, and shows end. What I want is continuity." This perspective unsettled the authorities. Some wanted to use him as a poster boy for actions they never took. Others tried to link his image to political parties or movements. But Eduardo remained unwavering. To him, real politics was done with your hands, with a hammer, a wet cloth, a patched-up fan. And when someone asked what he thought of all this national recognition, he would simply smile and point to the growing patches of shade. "This here is the only medal I care about." Once during one of those celebrity visits, a TV host insisted that he say something inspiring, something to move the country. Eduardo thought for a few seconds, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his cap, and replied, "What's really impactful is seeing an elderly person who used to faint now napping peacefully." Then he turned away and went to fetch more water to share with the children. The depth of his attitude started to inspire others. Volunteers began to show up, not with cameras but with tools. People who had never been involved in anything before began to ask themselves, "What can I do with what I have?" Because by rejecting awards, Eduardo posed the most powerful question of all, a challenge that didn't fit in a headline, but exploded in every conscience. And you? Are you going to wait for a trophy to do something, or will you start now with what you've got? That question lingered in the air like an unexpected breeze on a scorching day, cutting through pride, breaking down, excuses poking at comfort zones. And it was in that quiet gust that many new stories began to emerge. A street cleaner from a coastal town decided to turn the neighborhood bus stop into a shaded shelter. A teacher renovated her school's courtyard with donated materials. A group of young people from the countryside set up a sound system broadcasting hydration tips and collective care. None of them waited for cameras. None waited for a badge. All were inspired by the same idea: act with what you have. And Eduardo? He remained in the same place. Not in the geographic sense, but symbolically. He continued being the invisible anchor of a transformation built on humility. One afternoon, a child asked if he was ever going to rest. He smiled, picked up one of the brooms, and replied, "When the sun rests, I'll rest too." The little girl laughed, and he laughed along with her, then kept sweeping the floor of the shelter, where entire stories of dignity now found rest. Because in the end, what remained weren't the headlines, nor the rejected awards, not even the unanswered invitations. What remained was the echo of that question: will you wait for a trophy or will you start now? The neighbors remember it well. When Eduardo left that scorching morning, it seemed like a farewell. "There he goes, poor guy," they whispered, as if witnessing an inevitable tragedy. The heat had soared past 50 degrees Celsius. The ground felt like burning coal, and people's eyes were dry, not from a lack of emotion, but from a lack of hope. No one believed anyone could return whole from that scenario, and in truth, no one expected anything from anyone anymore. But he came back, not just alive, he came back stronger. He returned with 38 lives on his back, an improvised shelter in his hands, a shade built from tarps and dignity, and a phrase painted in white on a cracked wall that would become a mantra: "It's not just shade that cools, it's respect." That scene became a collective memory, a turning point. Eduardo didn't come back with speeches. He came back with action. He came back with dehydrated people getting water, with elderly folks being fanned by children, with teens carrying buckets, and with a new look in every face watching it all become real. And the most curious part is, he didn't want to be a legend. He remained the same simple man, soft-spoken and calloused, still adjusting the tarps, reinforcing the ties, improvising fans out of plastic bottles. He didn't say much, but he was always doing something. And that, my friend, changes everything in a story. Once, a persistent reporter wanted to know if Eduardo realized the risk he took venturing out into that unbearable heat. Eduardo gave a quiet chuckle, the kind that says more than 1,000 words, and answered with the serenity of someone who had already stared abandonment in the face. "Yeah, I knew. But what kills isn't the heat, it's indifference." That phrase landed on the front page of a newspaper. It became embroidered on t-shirts, graffiti on walls, even the subject of a university lecture. But Eduardo, he didn't give lectures. He chose to stay on the ground, organizing children's corners, creating water rotation systems, welcoming newcomers in search of shade and dignity. His speech was action, his presence, a quiet revolution. From that moment on, the story was no longer his alone. It became a symbol. Eduardo came to be known as the man who went out to die. But those who truly understood what happened knew. He went out to fight. He went out to prove that when someone puts themselves between life and death with their bare hands, no badge, no funding, no promise of return, they carve a new path for everyone. A path not built by politics, but by posture. A road made of courage and love for others. But for that path to hold strong, it needed to spread. It needed to become culture, example, contagion. And that's exactly what began to happen there. In that community once invisible to the powerful, families who barely greeted each other began to share the same water jug. Youth who once felt useless discovered that they could serve, and serve well. Children learned that shade doesn't come only from trees, but from gestures. Teachers began using Eduardo's story in the classroom. His phrase became a writing exercise, a group discussion, inspiration for school posters. It's not just shade that cools, it's respect, and it truly was. Because what brought relief wasn't just the wet cloth on someone's forehead, it was the awareness that someone cared, and it didn't stop there. Other residents began to mobilize. In nearby empty lots, new structures started to appear. Tarps, sticks, buckets, all improvised, all functional. A group of young people created a rotating system to assist elderly individuals with limited mobility. A retired bricklayer donated tools. A teacher started a children's reading workshop under the shade of the shelters, and when the heat returned, and when it always did, there was no panic. There was a plan, there was unity, there was belonging, because that story had taught them that dignity is not something you wait for, it's something you build. What Eduardo started as an act of resistance turned into a movement. NGOs began visiting the site. Some came to help, others just wanted to capitalize on the story. But Eduardo, as always, kept his humble and firm stance. He declined awards, titles, exclusive interviews. He used to say, "If you want to honor me, build more shade, create more respect." And that's why, even without a diploma, he became a master of action, a master of listening, a master of the kind of simplicity that transforms. One day, a politician showed up, barely stepped into the shelter and already had aides filming, cameras rolling, striking a rehearsed pose. Eduardo watched, waited, and then did what no one expected. He placed a bucket of water in the politician's hands and said, with the same calm as always, "Help cool off the elderly." The man gave an awkward chuckle, mumbled something about commitments, and left. The cameras turned off, but the community didn't forget, because in that moment, another story was born. One that teaches that true representation isn't measured by a badge, but by presence. And so, between reinforced tarps and a phrase painted on the wall, Eduardo kept being a beacon that didn't seek the spotlight, but lit the path for those who came after. His name began circulating in conversations, international articles, and school books. But to him, none of that mattered more than seeing someone sit in the shade and breathe in relief. That's what moved him. That's what made him keep going. Because deep down he knew, every time a new shade was built, a new story was born. A story that silently said, "Here, no one is invisible." After everything, what remained wasn't just the shelter. It was a new mindset, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of existing. The community understood, through practice and sweat, that waiting for help from above could be too costly, that placing eternal trust in empty promises meant leaving yourself at the mercy of luck or neglect. So they started acting on their own, quietly, without spotlights, without funding, but with a sense of urgency that only those who felt their skin burn on hot concrete could understand. They built new shelters in other empty lots. They used what they had, old wood, torn tarps, bent nails, but with a care that resembled art. They created shared water routes, with buckets going from house to house. They organized rotation systems to care for the elderly. Every morning someone brought fruit, another picked up medicine, another adjusted the shade. It was as if pain had taught them what school sometimes doesn't: solidarity in action. The children began helping to wet the cloths. They did it joyfully, like it was a game, but they knew they were saving lives. Teenagers who used to spend their days in silence or rebellion began assembling recycled fans using old printer motors. They became improvisation engineers, masters of the workaround. And so, a new story began to emerge. A story made of belonging, collective action, and hands that give without expecting anything in return. And perhaps the most beautiful part, transformation without spectacle. Local schools changed. Teachers began using Eduardo's example in the classroom, not as a martyr, not as a superhero, but as a regular person who did something extraordinary. They would say, "It's not about being a hero, it's about being human." And they were right. Because what happened there was more than just a shelter. It was a silent scream that it is possible to resist with dignity. A living reminder that true revolution begins when we stop asking for permission to care for others. Families who once barely greeted each other were now sharing the same water jug. The heat accomplished what no public campaign ever had. It united. It tore down invisible walls, dissolved old grudges. People who used to avoid eye contact started smiling. People who never spoke began helping one another. Young people who felt useless discovered the value of service. They discovered there is power in carrying a water bottle, in installing a tarp, in offering shade. And every time the heat returned, they knew exactly what to do. They didn't wait. They acted. And maybe that's the greatest lesson in these stories. You don't need to be rich, important, or famous to change the reality around you. You just need courage to begin. Courage to speak up even when no one listens. Courage to act even if you're alone. Courage to understand that the world changes when we change how we see it. Because sometimes, what looks like the end is actually the starting point for something greater. That's what Eduardo showed. No speeches, no media, no position. Just consistency between what he felt and what he did. And the impact was so deep, he couldn't even measure it. When people asked, "How did you come up with this idea?" he would smile and answer simply, "It wasn't an idea. It was a need." And there lies the heart of change. When need becomes action. When discomfort becomes direction. When frustration becomes a path. And you know what's most beautiful? Eduardo didn't start an NGO. He didn't ask for donations. He didn't wait for likes. He just acted. And because of that, dozens of other communities began replicating the idea. Eduardo's shades started appearing in other cities. People organizing, mobilizing, caring. And it all began with a tarp, a few pieces of wood, and the will not to let anyone faint into oblivion. Authorities showed up, of course. Later, too late, when they were no longer needed. And that was symbolic too, because it showed that in times of abandonment, the people can be their own shelter, can be their own strength. And this story didn't end there. It spread like a breeze through alleyways, like hope between walls, like seeds in the hands of those who now understand. Change doesn't come from outside. It comes from within the home, from within ourselves. Eduardo, with his calloused hands and eloquent silence, taught more than 1,000 public campaigns. He showed that true leadership doesn't need a microphone, just coherence. He showed that loving others isn't weakness, it's strength, that caring for others isn't charity, it's justice, and that no city will ever be truly fair while someone is still collapsing on the hot pavement of indifference. Today, anyone walking through that community sees more than just a shelter. They see a movement. They see awareness. They see action. The murals painted by children read, "Here, dignity has shade. Here, no one is invisible." And with each scorching day, new gestures arise. Because now, it's no longer about Eduardo. It's about what he awakened, about what remained, about what bloomed. And that's why this story matters. Because it's not just about what was done, it's about what can still be done. By me, by you, by anyone who has the courage to look at another with empathy, who understands that shade is also affection, that water is also respect, that dignity can be built through small acts. And now that you know this story, answer me honestly. What have you been doing with what you have? I know, the question might sting, because we live in a time where it feels like action only counts if it's grand, spectacular on a stage, with likes and recognition. But the truth is something else. The truth is that the greatest transformations start backstage, in silence, in the shadows, with ordinary people doing what they can, however they can. How many times have you waited for a solution from the outside when you could have been the start of something? How many times have you thought you needed more resources, more support, better conditions, when in fact you already had enough to take the first step? Eduardo's story isn't just about heat, tarps, and dignity. It's about you, about me, about the choices we make, or don't, with what we already have. You don't have to build an entire shelter. You don't need to be a hero or go around saving the world. Sometimes it's enough to offer emotional shade to someone who's melting on the inside. A gesture of listening, a cup of water and quiet for someone who just needs to be heard. A simple "I'm here" said at the right time. Small actions that don't make headlines but become stories in the hearts of those who receive them. Because deep down, we don't need miracles. We need presence. And I know you might be tired, worn out, overwhelmed by problems, life stretched thin, calendar packed. But look, Eduardo was too. And even so, he did what was possible. He didn't wait for the ideal scenario. He created one with his own hands. He took what little he had, old tools, quiet courage, and real empathy, and turned that into a revolution of shade, of respect, of humanity. We live in a world collapsing under selfishness, a world where everyone wants to talk, but few want to listen, where many live inside bubbles and those who suffer in silence. In this world, kindness has become a revolution, just like that. A hug at the right time, a sincere compliment, a mindful glance, small things that change everything. Because in this harsh landscape, being kind is a radical act. It means swimming upstream. And that's why the question I ask you now is simple and direct. Are you going to keep waiting? Waiting for the right moment, for the funding to come, for help to arrive, for the weather to change? Or are you going to act with what you have now in your own way, in your own time? Because there are people near you who need a gesture from you. And it doesn't have to be big. It just has to be real. Eduardo wasn't a politician, or a celebrity, or influential, but he built a shelter that became a symbol. He made an entire community believe again in the power of care. He inspired volunteers, mobilized donations, moved a country, and all of it, through simple actions, sincere ones, human ones, the kind of things anyone can do, including you. The difference between being a spectator and being a protagonist is a choice, and no one can make that choice for you. It's scary, I know. We ask ourselves if it'll work out, if people will laugh, if they'll understand. But the truth is, acting with your heart is always a risk, and always a chance to make something meaningful, to touch someone, to change the day of someone who had already lost hope. You know what moves me most in these stories? It's that they don't depend on titles or name tags or impressive resumes. They are born from the purest thing inside us, the will to see others well. And when that will is genuine, it becomes a bridge. It becomes strength. It becomes a beacon. So please, don't keep this story to yourself. If it touched you, if it stirred something inside you, share it. Leave a comment. Send it to someone who might need a push of humanity. Sometimes a message like this arrives at the exact right moment, like shade in the middle of the desert, and it can change everything. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell. Stick with us. Because this space isn't just about videos, it's about transformation. It's about opening eyes, hearts, and minds. It's about remembering that beauty still exists in the world, that there are still people making a difference, and that you can be one of them, truly. The next story might be yours, and if it is, we'll be here to tell it. Because every gesture you make, no matter how small it seems, can be the start of something bigger, and the world needs that. It needs you. So before you close this video, do one thing. Look around. See who's in need of shade, of water, of affection, and offer what you have, even if it's just your presence, just your ear, just a count on me. Because what you have, when it comes from the heart, is already more than enough to change someone's story, and changing one story is already changing the world.